So I want to comment, and I think I'll try to read the report from the Global Times. It's quite a good report on the situation in Brazil. But as I'm pulling that up, I just want to say, you know, I'm very pleased that it seems like Lula is on the way to victory. It's not for certain. It was a lot closer than I think a lot of people thought it was going to be based on polls. But from people I've been listening to, Convo Couch folks, I've been listening to I've been listening to folks who were there. They seem to be less surprised. And now I wanted to comment on why that may be. So there has been an incredible backlash. It's not talked about. A lot of it's been talked about as, oh, there's these contemporary issues. But I think we have to remember that Brazil has faced an incredible backlash against the leftist forces there. And Brazil is a very repressive police apparatus. It has and its oligarchy is very deeply embedded in the military state there. Right? It wasn't too long ago, 1960s, that Brazil had a fascist dictatorship. So Brazil has a very specific history, and Lula da Silva, right? He was imprisoned after he was president, of course, on false corruption charges. And Dilma Rousseff in 2014-15, she was overthrown in a judicial coup, which was also fraudulent. And that judicial coup put into place the mechanism from which Jair Bolsonaro won. So that apparatus is still in place, and we have seen Bolsonaro's forces in this election also do quite well in the Senate. And I think we should not underestimate the power of the oligarchy, of the media, the private media, and just the power that what I think Bolsonaro is, an extension of the military dictatorship and regime and the right-wing forces that seek to bring Brazil's poor into a permanent state of immiseration that only gets worse and worse. That's not been talked about. So I wanted to say that before getting into how the Global Times has covered it yesterday. So China says, this is the Chinese perspective here, China says Brazil to face deepening political polarization after tighter than expected first-round election. Political polarization will continue to deepen and political violence is likely to happen during the following election, Chinese experts predicted, as far-right incumbent Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and his leftist rival, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, are set for a runoff election at the end of the month after a tighter than expected first round. With fierce competition between the two candidates, tensions between supporters on both sides have risen. In his speech, Bolsonaro referred to his supporters as a quote-unquote army. Lula has received sporadic threats of attack since the election campaign kicked off in mid-August, and his campaign team has urged him to wear bulletproof vests at public events. Chinese experts warned that the January 6th U.S. Capitol Hill riot may repeat in Brazil, but the largest emerging country in the Southern Hemisphere is expected to maintain friendly and cooperative relations with China, especially economic cooperation, no matter which party comes to office, which is very important to China because now Brazil is part of BRICS, right? The financial alliance that seeks to create alternative currencies and financial structures to be more independent from the West. And Brazil really does need China's investment and China's trade. That is very true. But I will say this. I organize, I'm a co-editor with Friends of Socialist China, and we held an event where Dilma Rousseff spoke, and she spoke about China. And a prominent Chinese academic at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences also spoke. He taught in Shanghai, and he said that right away after her speech, he said, I can tell you that my colleagues and that most Chinese people I've spoken to about this matter want Lula to win this election. I mean, this event happened a few months ago, but nonetheless, I think it's very important to note. With 99.7% of electronic votes counted, Lula was ahead with 48.4% of the votes versus 43.3% for Bolsonaro, the National Election Authority reported Sunday night. Neither candidate won a majority, so the race will go to a second round on October 30th. Before Sunday's vote, several opinion surveys had shown that leftist Lula, who was a president from 2003 to 2010, led far-right Bolsonaro by 10 to 15 percentage points. The tight result dashed hopes for a quick resolution to a deeply polarized election in the world's fourth largest democracy, Reuters said. Unlike the overwhelming victory predicted by pollsters in the media, Lula only had a less than 5% lead over Bolsonaro, which means that Lula is not a sure win in the second round of the election, said Xu Xiqing, a research fellow at Latin American Studies at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told the Global Times on Monday. During the less than a month's time remaining, both presidential candidates entering the final race will be doing their best to win voters over in the middle, Xu noted. Xu noted that the narrow gap between the two candidates in the first round of voting reflects a serious division in Brazil and will have a significant impact on the subsequent election, intensifying polarization and possibly generating political violence in the country. The expert noted that Brazil has a larger voting base and uses electronic counting. If Bolsonaro loses the election, his margin for victory over Lula is small. Bolsonaro may copy the path of former president of the United States, Donald Trump, and refuse to recognize the election results. There is a possibility Brazil could see the same version of the Capitol riot that followed the U.S. presidential election of 2020, Xu said. So, fears are also arising among analysts that the far-right Bolsonaro, who idolizes Trump, may refuse to accept the results if he loses, paving the way for a January 6th-style institutional breakdown in Latin America's biggest country, according to Reuters. So, that's a concern, okay? And now they're going to talk about the rare intensity of this election. It's a party rivalry, left-right confrontation, and following it, there's been threats, intimidation, political violence, which have grown, says experts, but it's a reflection of the inherent political contradictions in Brazil's society, its economy, and it's a microcosm of polarized politics in the context of COVID-19 and global turmoil. Experts at the UN expressed their concerns in September regarding the ongoing defamatory campaign and continued attacks against democratic institutions, such as the judiciary and the electoral system in Brazil, including the electronic electoral system. They called on Brazil's authority to protect and duly respect the work of electoral institutions. So Xu pointed out that Lula and Bolsonaro, who belong to different political camps, have many differences in their views. Lula's lead is partly due because of in the current vote share to his achievements in poverty alleviation during his years in office, said Xu. Xu noted that during his administration, Lula had proposed a zero hunger strategy aiming at gaining the support of many lower and middle class workers, while Bolsonaro's supporters are mostly entrepreneurs, so business people. Lula opposed privatization and advocated more taxes on the rich, while Bolsonaro advocated privatization and pension reform. In foreign relations, Lula created the Union of South American Nations and supported Latin American integration, while during Bolsonaro's term, Brazil withdrew from there and suspended its participation in all these institutions. As the largest emerging country in the Southern Hemisphere, Brazil's political trends are regional wind vane. If Lula is elected, it will push the return of the left wing in the region, which will inevitably have an important impact on geopolitics in Latin America and the reconstruction of the international order, analysts pointed out. Before the Brazil election, the region already had seen a shift in political preference indicated by a surge in the election of left-wing leaders amid the economic and social crises aggravated by the pandemic. This includes Chile, Honduras, Peru, Bolivia, and have led to claims that Latin America is going through another pink tide, the political movement that saw the rise of left-wing leaders across the continent in the early 2000s, according to media reports. I also want to add Venezuela is stronger than ever, all right? So Venezuela is actually growing in Venezuela's popularity in terms of the Bolivarian movement, the Party for Socialism in Venezuela, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. The popularity is growing there as well. Several media and Nicaragua, we can't forget Nicaragua, the re-election of Daniel Ortega. So you have Argentina. Did they say Argentina here? No. So Argentina as well, even though there are contradictions there, but Argentina as well. Several media reports have predicted if Lula wins the election, it will mean a leftward shift in the political direction of Brazil after many years, as well as a clearer crescendo of the leftist wave in Latin America. So, that's about it. I don't want to go. So then it talks about China's relationship. Exports to Brazil from China, about 19 billion in the first quarter of 2022, 23% of Brazil's total imports. China's imports from Brazil totaled 19.7 billion, accounting for 29% of Brazil's total exports. So basically a quarter of Brazil's economy is reliant on China on average. So that's very important to note. And I think China does a really good report here, summarizing what the media has said. And I hope this is an education for maybe newcomers to this channel who don't know how I do things. I pay attention to media from China, from Russia, from all over, because I think we need to understand the perspective, and also to demonstrate that actually the reporting is quite good, and quite unbiased. Unlike in Western corporate media, we didn't see any demonization really of. I mean, we saw um, statements about Bolsonaro. I don't think China wants to see Bolsonaro win, right? But we also saw that the rhetoric was still um, quite even and balanced, unlike in the United States where it's been an anti-Lula campaign. You have whole articles written in the Western corporate media in places like CNBC talking about why Lula shouldn't win, why he's terrible for Brazil, right? What right is it of the United States to even weigh in on that? The Western corporate media to weigh in on that when the United States' political system is a basket case that absolutely has no legitimacy, right? You have like 10% trust in Congress, less than 40% trust in the job that Joe Biden is doing. It seems like the United States has a lot of problems, not to mention its horrific electoral system that still discriminates based on a race, and also just constantly is being dictated by the rule of monopolies, banks, and big capital. So, my closing thoughts on this, okay, is that I mean, I'm all in for Lula. And the reason I'm all in for Lula is because Lula represents a shift to the left. And that doesn't say that Lula is going to solve all the problems in Brazil. And there are many of those. I mean, Brazil also has a deep race issue. Afro Brazilians, African uh, Brazilians of African descent, Brazilians of indigenous descent, the state of the Amazon, all of that. Those are really big and deep questions that are hard for a political movement like the PT to completely address because of its own internal contradictions, but also because Brazil's government is not necessarily being transformed. So even during Lula, there was great progress on poverty alleviation. And that's why I support Lula, because Lula is for the poor, he's for the working class. But there's still going to be contradictions in Brazil that aren't going to be resolved. And the political situation is going to be pretty tenuous in Brazil. That's just a reality that we just have to acknowledge. But we also have to take a side, I think, on this issue. Doesn't mean that we interfere in the process directly, but it does mean that there is really a polarized political line being drawn in this election. It's Bolsonaro who represents capital, who represents the far right, the actual far right, not like some kind of horseshoe neoliberal theory, anything like that. Bolsonaro is the oligarchy, all right? And Lula is a representative of the workers. That's his roots. That's how he governed. And while Brazil's political situation is very complex, and there certainly isn't going to be some kind of revolutionary transformation in Brazil, it will represent a step forward. And regionally and internationally, it's so important because a victory for Lula is another hit to the U.S.'s Monroe Doctrine and its imperialist subversion and domination on this continent, South America, as well as around the world.